The only thing better than dad jokes are dad stories. And you'll get to hear them all month long here on Manly with Andy. I'm calling them the Father's Day Cargo Shorts. Here's one from the morning show host from WBGL in Champaign, Illinois, Johnathan Eltrevug.
Hey, Andy. Well, my dad, when he passed away in September of 2022, he didn't leave me a big inheritance or anything like that. I remember he had a whole bunch of $100 bills wadded up on his bedside. On the table, he had maybe like some water that he would sip out of. He had an old ratty-looking lamp that I still have in my house to this day. He had a coffee cup of about 25 or 30 pencils in it. And then he had just this huge wad of cash, $100 bills. I remember one time he told me, he said, I got to have my wad of cash and my wallet with me at all times. If I don't have that, he said, I feel naked. And I'm like, well, Dad, I don't want you to feel that way, so carry your wad of cash. It was really kind of, ironic in a way that even at his deathbed, he had a huge wad of cash. The reason I mention this is because those $100 bills that he left me was basically all he had. He had his apartment that was full of a bunch of stuff, but there wasn't much value there. 90% of it went to the dumpster. He left behind these $100 bills, and with those $100 bills, we pretty much paid for his burial. We paid for his grave plot. We paid for his cremation and maybe a few other things that needed to be paid for around that time. And afterwards, there was just a little bit of money left, and my sister and I split it. And that was kind of the way it worked as far as our inheritance. It was just several $100 bills each, and that was it. And that was fine. Didn't expect anything else from my dad. He gave me all of his love. And even though we had a complicated relationship throughout really my entire life, where sometimes he would be in my life and sometimes he wouldn't be in my life, he had his own struggles, but he loved Jesus. And the last 3 years of his life were the best as far as I'm concerned, because we got to know each other so well, sharing back and forth on an app called Voxer, which is a pretty neat app. And it's just basically a walkie-talkie type app where you can send a recording of your voice to him, and then he sends a recording of his voice back to me. It's like little recordings back and forth. It's kind of like texting, but we're talking at each other. My dad was a talker, but he wasn't really a listener. And I can be that way sometimes too, like father, like son to some degree. When I would record my voice, well, he would be forced to listen. He couldn't interrupt me. He couldn't ask questions in the middle of it, but he could stop the recording and make a note on something that I said, and then he would go back to it, start it again. Before Voxer ever came out, one thing that he actually liked to do was he had one of those little like micro mini cassette recorder things. It's where the cassette that goes into the player is probably about an inch long, and then you barely can open this little door that opens up, and you put the tape in there and you hit play, and then it starts, and you can push up to rewind, and it'll go one of those little things. He used to mail those back and forth. He had 2 of those recorders. He mailed one to me so that I had my own recorder and he had his recorder, and then he would mail the tapes back and forth, and that's how he would communicate. He said he injured his hand a long time ago. He doesn't like to write letters. Neither of us were very much for the telephone, and so that's what we would do. And so come into the 21st century, and here there's this app called Voxer, and all he has to do is push a button to start it and a button to stop it, and he can talk as much as he wants. So it's like my dad's dream. My dad's dream. And it worked out pretty well for me, too, because sometimes I could only take my dad in bite-sized chunks, Maybe I'm going for a walk or a run, and I'll say, okay, I'll listen to 5 minutes of Dad right now. And then, boom, I'd take a break and come back to it later. Earlier, I said that we got to know each other. I don't know if it was so much that we got to know each other as it was we listened to each other. The neat thing about the app is that it's one-way communication, and some people say, I don't like that, but for some reason, me and him, it was like we were made to communicate on Voxer. And again, with him being out of my life, in and out of my life throughout really my whole life, up until my mid-30s, it was really something that we were able to maintain kind of this constant connection for the last 3 years of his life. Now, we didn't know it was going to be the last 3 years of his life, but really that whole journey of him getting sick and then, refusing medical treatment and me getting really mad because he didn't want to be treated, and then we talked through it, we figured it out. It all happened on Voxer. So the interesting thing about that app is that the messages that you send to each other expire after 30 days. So somewhere along the line, I became a paid Voxer member. I think it's called Voxer Pro. And for $3.99 a month, you get access to all these other options and bells and whistles and stuff. But an added feature of that is that your Voxers, that's what they're called, the messages you send back and forth, they never expire. So they just sit on there. Well, somewhere along the line, when my dad started getting sick, I thought, well, this is something I want to hang on to because someday he's going to be gone, and I'm going to want to go back to all these hundreds and hundreds of messages that we sent to each other. And sure enough, that's exactly the way it worked. So when he died on September 15th, 2020, at just a few minutes before midnight, ever since that time, I have continued paying that $3.99 a month. And every time that $3.99 a month shows up on my checking account statement and it says Voxer Pro or whatever it says, monthly subscription, it makes me remember, oh, yes, you have those hundreds and hundreds of messages on the server that you still have access to because you've continued being a member. And so very regularly, I'll go back and open up that app. I really don't communicate with anybody else anymore because I've moved on to the kind of video version of that app called Marco Polo. But I use Voxer primarily now. I'll open it up and find the conversation thread I had going on with my dad. And there were certain ones that I can still access to this day, but certain ones that are the ones that he told me the things that I always want to remember. Some of those things were his life stories, some of the regrets and mistakes that he made. His kind of mantra was always do as I say, not as I do, which is not the best Father's Day advice by any means. But he knew that he wasn't one to have his life together, but he knew what was right. And he always felt that his life was generally an example of what not to do. And I said, Dad, that's somewhat the case, but it's also not completely the case because there are a lot of things that my dad did that I'm very intentional about continuing to want to do. One of which is like opening up with my children, communicating to them and letting them know how much I love and respect and appreciate them. But there were some of these long Voxers when he went on and on and on as I was opening up my heart to him and talking about some of the problems that I was encountering, trouble in my marriage, which unfortunately after his death ended up in divorce. But a lot of those day in and day out hardships of life, he was one of the only people that I talked to about that. And if you told me 10 or 15 years prior that when you get into your mid-30s, you're going to be talking to your dad on an app about all these kinds of things, or certainly that he's going to send you 10, 15, 20 minutes of straight-up pure encouragement and I'm proud of you type messages, I don't know that I would have believed it. But it's exactly what happened. And all that is what comes to mind every time I am billed $3.99 every month for that subscription.